Okay, Lindsay, tell us what's in your lens today.
Yeah, so President Trump signed an executive order making it easier for cities and states to remove homeless people from the streets and get them treatment elsewhere. The order also calls on Attorney General Pam Bondi to, quote, seek in appropriate cases the reversal of federal or state judicial precedents and the termination of consent decrees that impede the United States policy of encouraging civil commitment of individuals with mental illness who pose risks to themselves or the public, according to a White House fact sheet. On the surface, this is framed as a solution, but underneath, it represents a troubling expansion of forced institutionalization with few real answers about that long-term care. President Trump's recent executive order on homelessness, which prioritizes forced relocation of unhoused people to treatment centers and penalizes open-air encampments, reads more like a campaign tactic than a compassionate or effective public policy. Now, while public frustration around homelessness is understandable, this order channels that frustration in the wrong direction, targeting symptoms instead of causes and people instead of systems. Framing homelessness as a threat to public safety rather than a humanitarian crisis is not only dangerous, it's inaccurate. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said, quote, by removing vagrant criminals from our streets and redirecting resources towards substance abuse programs, the Trump administration will ensure that Americans feel safe in their own communities. Now, this kind of language paints unhoused people as these violent offenders, despite studies like one from the University of Central Florida showing that unhoused individuals are typically arrested for non-violent infractions like public intoxication or shoplifting, not for violent crimes. In fact, research shows they are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. Trump's approach to homelessness relies on institutionalization, encampment sweeps, and prioritizing states that crack down on outdoor sleeping. But it offers no real investment in building or preserving affordable housing, which experts across the political spectrum agree is the core issue. Jesse Rabinowitz of the National Homelessness Law Center said it best, quote, Trump's expected actions are reckless, expensive, and make homelessness worse. Real leaders focus on solutions, not kicking people when they're down. Supporters of the order argue that it gets people into treatment, but forced treatment rarely ever leads to long-term recovery, especially when it's divorced from stable housing. Research has consistently shown that housing first, which prioritizes placing people in permanent housing before mandating treatment or sobriety, reduces homelessness by up to 88% and lowers costly emergency care visits. The problem isn't that housing first failed, it's that we underfunded it and we were inconsistent with it. We were inconsistent in the way we applied it across the country. This order also disproportionately affects Black and brown communities, LGBTQ people, and people with disabilities, groups that are already overrepresented in the unhoused population. And in cities like D.C., where Trump is directing federal agencies to evict people from public parks, the move will simply push people out of sight, further away from services and case managers. A few high-profile tragic incidents involving homeless individuals should not dictate national policy. Fear should not be our driving response to poverty. If we want real results, we need real solutions. Housing, mental health access, wraparound services, and most importantly, we have to have humanity. Homelessness isn't a crime, and treating it like one is not going to solve it.
All right, so really interesting executive order from the Trump administration here. I had a couple of things I wanted to touch on that you talked about in your lens. The first of which being the housing first policy that you're talking about. And I suppose I disagree with the premise that housing first has been effective or that it would be more effective if it had more funding. We saw that between 2018 and 2023, permanent supportive housing in the United States increased by 30%. But at the same period of time, homelessness grew by 60%. And specifically in Arizona, in 2024, they had 9,435 people that were considered homeless, whereas they had 9,797 permanent housing units, and yet homelessness grew again over the past year. In fact, they built over 7,000 permanent housing units since 2010, but homelessness increased 50%. So I guess I would just be curious where the evidence is that putting people in housing first before addressing the substance abuse and mental illness problems is an effective strategy.
Well, I think what Housing First was implemented in 2004 under a Republican president, George Bush and his administration. And I think like following through, a lot of times we have these federal programs that we will implement and sound like a good idea and then get pushed through. This was kind of bipartisan, right? Because then Obama followed it up and continued it. And I think just putting the right funding and implementing it properly alongside treatment for people, right? Because we know that when we paint them, which is the bigger point, as criminals or paint them in any other way versus misunderstood, and maybe all of them don't need substance abuse addiction resources or institutionalization, they might need a roof over their head. And when we think about the core issue and what's starting all of this is that people don't have access to anything, whether it's care or housing. And so putting them in a covered roof over their head and providing a stability, which is I think the baseline, which I'm talking about, to get people to get better health. Like you could ask people to be as healthy as they want to be as unaddicted to anything as you want to, but if they have nowhere to go, desperate times, right, call for desperate measures, which would lead to that turnaround where you're back on drugs or back in the street. And so what I'm saying is give people an opportunity to clean up their act in a way that leads with humanity first by providing some sort of shelter and then allowing them to grow past that, because the basic needs are just the basic needs. And so that's kind of what I'm talking about when I say that we need to make sure that we're doing things in tandem. And I think starting with housing would probably be more effective than just throwing everybody into, an institution where they can possibly get care and it could possibly not be effective.
If somebody were addicted to drugs or struggling from mental illness, would you support them getting treatment if there were a permanent housing solution or a halfway house after the fact?
For sure. Yeah, I think that we have to, and also I guess the problem with Trump's policy, to finish answering the question, is that there's the executive order is the problem with most executive orders, right? They're not fully instituted until they're codified by Congress. But also when you think about what's next, like, yes, getting people off the streets and, mostly Democratic leadership by making their cities suffer if they don't get people off the streets immediately, and, finding people that have encampments and doing all those kind of things help. But what's the long-term solution when people do get off the streets, when people do get substance abuse treatment? Like, what are the next steps? And those are important to point out, and not just in the executive order, but when we hash this through Congress, when we actually make this a full policy, what are those next steps? Because that has to be clear, because then otherwise we just have people who went through some sort of short reformation program and then maybe turn right back around to the same things.
One of the things that I found interesting related to the DC homelessness crisis was that during the Obama administration in 2022 to 2023, they actually directed the National Park Service to start this process of cleaning the encampments out of the public parks. I was present for the clearing out at McPherson Square. I know they did it at Columbus Circle prior to Biden giving his big speech from Union Station. And what they found at that time in the data was that there was ample enough shelter space for the homelessness population in DC, but the problem that they were having was that people would not go into the shelters because they either had to give up their tent or they had to not abuse drugs. And so that was sort of the sticking point for me, where I thought, okay, well, we need to treat the root causes of why they're homeless first. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to keep them in permanent housing and make sure that they're getting well. And to me, that's not really a compassionate solution either. You have two solutions. You leave people on the streets, or you put someone who's struggling with one of these issues in a house that's going to get potentially destroyed. In LA, for example, during COVID, they decided to put a lot of the homeless population in the hotels, and now a lot of those hotels are suing the LA government for hundreds of millions of dollars in damages.
And I think also it might be a little bit of a fundamental, cart before the horse thing, because do people lose everything and then get on drugs because they have nothing anymore? Or do people get on drugs and, it's like this circle merry-go-round. So it's kind of hard to decipher, but I just want a well thought out plan and not just everything executive order style.
All right, coming up next, big news for Paramount and Skydance. The FCC has approved their massive media merger. We'll break it all down next. Stay with us.